Let's pray and we'll get started. Lord, thank you for your word and that we get to study it and talk about it openly in this country, Lord. And I ask that you would just illuminate it to us, Lord, that you would teach us, that you would show us the things that we need to be learning and practicing. Amen. So, 1 Peter. We've been talking about 1 Peter, I heard. So I decided I'd do that. So it's kind of an interesting backdrop preaching this sermon. The next section is about submission to government. And so, with all the protests been going on, the death of Mr. George Floyd and everything that stemmed from that presents definitely an interesting backdrop to talking about this. It's God's sense of timing, I guess. So before we read that text, I want to read the two verses from last week, because these two verses frame the whole what goes in this section and the next few verses and chapters. And so I just want to remind us of that. So 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Abstain from evil desires, live such good lives that even though they might say something, they're going to be proved wrong. They're going to see that they're wrong. And then the next several sections of verses, this one, next week, the week after, are pretty much to the end of the book, are framed or about by these verses. He's saying this is what we should do as Christians because of this, that we want to be abstaining from sinful desires, and we want to live good lives so that we'll bring glory to God and silence, voices that are saying, oh, those Christians, they're just a bunch of do-nothing, rabble-rousers or whatever. So, with that, as a reminder, let's read the main text for today, and it's 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So, pretty straightforward and pretty direct. And I'll mention that it's not doesn't jump out at you as much in this verse as in other places in the Bible, but it's there especially in the Greek, and it's a consistent theme throughout the whole Bible that governmental authorities throughout the earth are established by God. This isn't just something that people invented and seemed convenient and that's it. But authorities are established by God. And one example of that is in Daniel, chapter 4, verse 17. And this is the story where Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about this big tree, this awesome, and then it gets cut down, but the stump gets left to just sit in the field and in the dew for a long time. And some angels, or it says messengers here, which is another word for angels, in the dream, tell Nebuchadnezzar why this is happening. And that's what's in verse 17. It says, the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict about cutting this tree down, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. In other words, your status doesn't make you more or less likely to be that leader. Even the lowliest can be set up. There's other places, Proverbs 21 comes to mind, where it talks about the heart of the king is like a water course that the Lord can direct where he will. And it's just replete throughout the Bible of places that it talks about the government being established by God. And I want to read this whole text too, because it kind of concerns this closely and has a lot of the same thoughts, and that's in Romans 13. And it says it very plainly. So let's read through that, verses 1 through 7. This is Paul also saying something very similar about authorities. He says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Think of the guys that rebelled against Moses. Moses didn't do anything to them, but the ground opened up and swallowed them. That was judgment they incurred because of that. For rulers hold no terror, verse 3, hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible judgment, but also as a matter of conscience. The authorities are established by God. This is why you also pay taxes. This is an interesting bit that we're not going to dive into today. This is why you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Similar to what Peter is saying. He's saying, submit yourselves to all authorities. They're established by God. He's saying, authorities are there to commend people who are doing good and to punish people who are doing wrong. He's saying this is God's will. Peter makes that especially clear. He says, do it for the Lord's sake. Don't use your freedom as an excuse for evil. Live as God's slave. This is part of doing this, submitting to authorities is part of that. And they end with a similar kind of summary, right? Peter says, show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And Paul ends with a similar summary. So, what's the context of what they're writing for them? Well, in the early Christian age, a lot of new believers were kind of, you might say, heady with this thought of, we're free. We're free. We need to live free. We need to re-examine everything. Circumcision, that's out. We don't got to do that. What about government? Should we be obeying government? What about marriage? Jesus taught that in heaven there's no marriage, so should we just all be single? A lot of stuff was kind of, we don't know. Does God want a social revolution? Is that what Jesus was preaching? And that was you see that in the subcontext of of what Peter's writing, of what Paul is writing as well. And they're saying, no, let's not get crazy. Don't use your freedom as an excuse to do something wrong. There's still an established order. These authorities have been established by God. You need to submit to those authorities. And I'll also add that Nero was emperor in both cases. Now, in Paul's case, he wrote Romans likely around 5 years before Peter wrote 1 Peter, and that was before Nero killed his mother and went off the deep end. But certainly by the time Peter was writing 1 Peter, he had gone off the deep end. But he's still saying, fear God, honor the emperor. He's saying submit to, and I was reading a commentator talking about this. He said there could be few rulers indeed, about Nero, whose claims on loyalty would be sustained by less personal merit. He certainly did not have personal merit. And it's I think of maybe a couple, maybe Hitler is one, but there are very few that have less personal merit. And yet, this is what Peter is saying, submit to these authorities. So, what about our context? Because we always talk about what's the context of what they were writing back then. Well, we're also reading it in a context. And what's our context when we're reading it? Well, the atrocities of the 20th century, genocides, the Holocaust, that's part of our context, right? As Americans, we kind of have an inherent distrust of government. That's why we set up all these checks and balances, and it's a brilliant system to kind of keep anybody from getting too power hungry and abusing power. And that's in our DNA, really, as a nation. The people that came here were the kinds of people that didn't want the King of England breathing down their back. And that's the kind of people that fought this war to get rid of him once and for all, and the kind of people that set up the government. I mean, it's there. So that's part of our context. So how many of you are thinking, what about when the government is doing wrong or asking me to do wrong? Yeah. Is Paul talking about an ideal government here that punishes evil and rewards good? Because what if a government is punishing good and rewarding evil? What's going on? And those are valid questions, but I do want to challenge you with this, that when we look at this passage, we shouldn't be saying, what are the exceptions? We should be saying, just what does it mean? What does it mean? What is he telling me to do? Not what are the exceptions to what he's telling me to do. Yes, they're there, the exceptions. Yes, we're going to talk about them. But I challenge you to focus on what is it that God is saying to us in our world today in this passage, not what are all the exceptions. Those are kind of easy to see and talk about. There's controversy in some of them. I'll get into that. But yeah, Mike, when 3 weeks ago, Mike Spencer, when he talked about submission, he said, looking through the loopholes. Are we, the difference between compliance and real submission? Are you looking for loopholes on how to get out of something? Well, in this case, I don't really have to file my taxes correctly or follow the speed limit. He gave examples about that. Now, we can't deny our context that we're reading. I read somebody saying that all the this was about Romans 13, all the commentaries since 1945 about that passage mention Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Because that looms, I mean, we can't deny it, that looms large in our context of how do we apply this passage. But again, I challenge you to not think about what are the exceptions as much as what are the things I need to be doing. So, and the reason is because we need you work on your weaknesses, not your strengths, right? For example, I'm somebody who's, I don't think anyone's ever accused me of being too confrontational as a general, personality trait. That, sure, there have been times where I've been too confrontational in an instance, and more than one. But people who know me probably wouldn't say, oh yeah, he's just habitually being super confrontational. And yet I've realized that there are times that I need to be more confrontational than I have been. And that I can't use my personality as an excuse to not develop good character. I know people that are the opposite, that tell me, oh yeah, I am too confrontational. I need to work on being less confrontational all the time, on saying it better, on that kind of stuff. So yeah, we got to work on our weaknesses is where we got to work the most. And I think our strength is seeing the exceptions. Our weakness is, let's not use our freedom as a cover-up for evil. Say, well, this is an exception, come on. Don't you buy that, Lord? Or are we really using our freedom as a cover-up for something that we shouldn't be doing? So with that, I do want to say some more words. Mike talked about this as well, about the word submit in the Greek. Hypotasso, it means to place oneself under, according to a given relationship, right? Place yourself under. And I'll mention as an aside, just a quick, the root words for this word happen to mean kind of what the word means. But a lot of times that's not the case, or not quite the case. And I say that because now we have the internet, right? And I'm not a Greek scholar, and I don't play one on TV, but I can go look up somebody's research on the internet. I can open up my Greek Strong's lexicon or whatever and go, oh, it comes from this root word. And oh, that's how interesting. And talk about, oh, this means this means that, and not necessarily know what I'm talking about, but I feel like I do because I read that, and the audience thinks that I do. And being an armchair Greek scholar is what we need to watch out for. And I'll give you a great example, which is kind of an extreme example, but it gets the point across really easy. The word nice in English comes from a Latin word that means ignorant. Nice, the two components, it means not knowing, ignorant or foolish. And in Middle English, in the, 1500s, 1400s, somewhere back in there, the common meaning of nice was stupid. If somebody said you were a nice person, that was not a compliment. And so it'd be easier for me if I was, an armchair English grammarian 1,000 years from now to unearth a manuscript and go, this guy is saying to this other guy, nice, that he is a nice person, but the root of nice means ignorant, so he's calling him an ignorant person. But the manuscript was written in 2020, and that's not what it means today. So that's an extreme example. Most words don't migrate meaning that much, but you get the point. Let's now that we all have the great resources, which are awesome, it's still prudent to not make a quick, it comes from this root word, therefore that's kind of what it has to mean. Anyway, enough said about that. Submission. To order oneself under or according to a given relationship. And this applies to, we're going to read the word submission lots of times in the next few sections. This applies to master-slave relationship in the next section, which to us is, employer-employee would be our analogy today. There's, marital relationships. There's church, submit to the elders, submit to one another. There's all these different, and so what is the order of the day, let's say? What is the established relationship that we need to say we're going to put ourselves under? And sometimes in these cases, it's kind of a little bit of both. I'm choosing to do it, but I also, in some sense, don't have a choice because God's telling me to do it. And Peter makes this point, live as God's slaves. And the word is, lots of translations put servant there, the word is slaves, doulos. And so, yeah. I looked it up on the internet. I read a book about the word doulos, but that was a long time ago. So yeah, we have to submit. We have to place ourselves under the given order. Now, the thing is, submission and obedience, right? It's actually a different word for obedience in Greek, just like it is in English. But the two are tied. You can't say that they're not related. The most common way to show submission outwardly is by obeying, right? And so there's some overlap, but submission is a lot broader than that, right? We're talking about I'm going to place myself under in this order, and I'm going to obey. But Mike did a good job about talking about this. Are we just being compliant on the outside, or is it really something from the heart? And that's what submission involves, something deeper, broader than that. It's maybe you could say the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, right? I'm actually, it's related to Jesus upping the game in the Sermon on the Mount, saying, okay, it's okay if you do this outwardly, but if you avoid, killing your neighbor, but if you just hate him, that's too much, right? So that kind of stuff. So submission starts in the heart and then goes out from there. Now, what about governments that don't reward good, that are asking us to do evil? What about situations like that? What about, and it can happen in a marriage, it can happen in an employer-employee relationship. It can happen that the person in authority is saying, I want you to do this, and you're like, I'm sure God would be take a very dim view of me doing that. And that's an understatement. So remember, I think the best way to explain that is this context that Peter and Paul have is people that were going to, or potentially thinking about going to an extreme the other way. And they're trying to bring them back here. They're not talking about this so much because that's not their problem. That's not their weakness. Again, he's focusing on what are the things that you need to improve on. He's not talking about, oh, gosh, you guys are not good at figuring out when you should maybe not follow what the government is saying, and I need to hammer that into you guys. No, that's not their problem. This is their problem. And so he's talking about this. It's implicit in what they're saying. It's implicit, this is one of those cases where you got to read the Bible as a whole, as most things. It's implicit that the idea of submission recognizes that God's at the top of any chain, right? We're going to read. Can't remember if it's in Peter and other verses, but that the man's head of the woman and God is the head of the man, right? Or that these government authorities are all established by God. He's always at the top of any of these chains of command. And so what they're saying, implicitly, there's an assumption, there's an underlying assumption that the ultimate submission to God is not something that can be substituted by anyone. No one can be God to me other than God. No one else can say, I demand your full allegiance, no questions asked, and all this different stuff, right? So that's an implicit thing in there. And that's where these exceptions arise, where we say, okay, you're saying we need to lock these people up just because of their beliefs or their religion, their race, their whatever, right? And all these genocides, these warlords in Africa fighting each other, all this stuff that comes from that sort of thing. Yeah, of course. That's not something we should do. That's somebody interjecting themselves, not following what God is saying to follow, because authorities still have a choice to submit to God's authority or not, to make the wrong decisions or not, right? So that's where that comes in. But I'll go back to saying, what is it that we, I think, struggle with more is I think that, especially given our context of Americans, is probably the biggest one that informs that, is, what's the exception? Is this a case where I can justify to myself, I don't have to do this? And someone named Wolf Strage, who I not read any of his stuff, but I ran across this quote in the commentary about 1 Peter. I really liked what he had to say. He said, yes, they're free with respect to the authorities, right? This bit about don't use your freedom as a cover for you. He says, yes, they're free to this respect to the authorities, but normally this freedom manifests itself in respect and loyalty, submission, and honor. That's normal. The exceptions are called exceptions for a reason. They're exceptions. The normal should be, normally, when I am being in submission to governmental authorities, when I am not using my freedom as an excuse, normally it should manifest in respect and honor and all that stuff. Being good citizens, right? And again, why are we doing this? I'll highlight the three phrases that I underlined. Verse 13, for the Lord's sake. Verse 15, for it is God's will that by doing good we should silence. And then live as God's slaves. That's why we're doing this. So let me give you an example about how we might, how this might go. It's a church example. It's not a government one, but I think it'll get the idea across. Let's say we're having an intercessory prayer time, and there's several people. They're each leading a section. We're going to pray for our nation. We're going to pray for our church. We're going to pray for whatever. Right? And one of the people that comes up and it says, "Look, we're going to pray about this topic, and I just really like ask everyone to pray out loud." And that's about all I say as far as justification or anything. I'm just asking you to do that. So, what's our first thought there? What if you don't feel like doing it? Okay, I was just content praying under my breath or in my head. The Bible teaches that God hears us no matter how we pray. I could be lying down on David prayed in his bed. I could be lying down on my bed right now. I don't need to pray out loud like the person leading has asked me. And by the way, in this example, it's whoever's leading. It could be Bev, it could be Valerie, it could be, not an elder, okay, not a pastor, not an associate pastor, not the youth pastor. It's the person leading that section. What's wrong with just saying, okay, we'll do it? What is it that's rising up within us going, and then we go, well, but the Bible says I don't have to, so At what point there are we using our freedom as a justification for evil? Did God tell the person it's really important to pray this out loud? I want it to be a declaration to the heavenlies. Is it okay that that person doesn't have to explain and justify all that to ask you, let's just pray out loud, please? So this isn't aimed at anybody in here. I just thought it'd be a good example. Maybe you can think of something similar you've experienced. I know I've been in that place where I was like, I was, let's say, I was kneeling and I was comfortable and they're asking me to stand, or I was sitting and they're asking me to kneel, or whatever, and I'm like, okay. And there have been times where I did it, and there have been times where I didn't do it. But you guys get the point, right? Yes? Okay. It's kind of quiet in here. So, yes. Pastor Pillow. Yep. So let's look at a few examples in the Bible, and then we'll talk about some stuff for us. I find that the book of Daniel is fantastic for talking about this kind of, leadership, this kind of situation. How do you submit to government authorities when they're not Christians and they're asking you to do anti-Christian things, and how do you respond, right? We see that from day one in the book, chapter 1. They gather up a whole bunch of prisoners of war from Israel. They pick out the finest young strapping lads, and they say, hey, you're going to be in charge of educating these guys for the next 3 years. I want you to teach them Babylonian literature, language. They didn't know the language. History, our culture, our beliefs, and physical exercise, looking good is also involved. I want them to have the best food. Look, the king is saying this. I'm going to give food from my own table. They're going to have the best meat, the best wine. It's going to be great. And at the end, they're going to enter service into the court. We want this to be a good process. And Daniel and his buddies in verse 8 of chapter 1, you're probably familiar with this, but Daniel resolved, he was determined not to defile himself. So when they came to him with that meat and that wine, he said, no thanks, I'll tell you where to put it. End of story. Because God's on my side in this matter, and I don't care. Or what it actually says is that although he had resolved not to defile himself, he still asked the chief official for permission to not do this. What would have happened if he'd not given his permission? Yeah, probably what I just described would have happened. He said, well, sorry, I got to do it anyway. But he didn't go about it that way. He said, I realize your neck's on the line too. That if after these 3 years we look all, sunken faces and wimpy and unhealthy, it's your neck. I mean, really? The king's given this guy this job. And he's given him all the resources to do the job. If the guy doesn't do the job, whose fault is it? It's not the king's. And all these people are under his authority, so he can't say, well, they didn't want to. I couldn't make them. So what did he do in this situation? He said, I want permission to do this. And the guy's skeptical. And he says, okay, well, let's do a test run. And they worked it out. And in submission, he did this, right? He didn't come in gun blazing, chest out. And then Daniel served this wicked kingdom a lot of off and on. You read especially the Nebuchadnezzar part. First he's like, oh, I acknowledge that God's God. And then later on he's like, hey, could you guys worship this statue of me? And then later on he's like, no, I definitely acknowledge that God is God. And it's just back and forth. And Daniel did not compromise. Then he didn't compromise when he was, the story about the lion's den, he was probably at the end of his life. He lived to be, we think, around 90. So we're talking about a frail, octogenarian going into this lion's den. He stood by his principles, but he didn't say, oh, that's an excuse for me to just not do anything. The story that I read, the verse that I read earlier about the dream, that always grabs me, because Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he calls Daniel, and he calls everybody to come in and help interpret it, but he really looks to Daniel, because Daniel's really good at this, and he's done it accurately before. And verse 19, 2 verses later, the king is done telling them what the dream was. He's looking to Daniel for the interpretation. And it says, then Daniel also called Belteshazzar, which, by the way, that was the name of the Nebuchadnezzar's god. He said, I'm going to change your name. Daniel, the L root there is El Elyon, Elohim. So his name has the real God in it. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to give you another name. I'm going to call you, from now on, you need to answer to Belteshazzar. We don't read anywhere that Daniel griped about this. I'm sure he didn't, love it, but it was like, whatever. So, imagine you get captured by Iran or something and they change your name to Muhammad. It's kind of like that. And you're like, but I liked my other name. Tough. So anyway, Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed when he's hearing this dream, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. And this is the part. Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only this dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. He could have said, you deserve it. You're going to get what's coming to you. Finally, God is going to show you that he's God and that you're nothing. But he was actually troubled. He wasn't, I don't believe he was saying this just to save his neck. Oh, I'm sorry that this is a bad word I'm about to give you. Because it was actually written on his face, and the king could see that he was troubled, and he said, tell me anyway, it's all right. That's how he reacted. That's how Daniel served in this time. That's a couple of great stories about how he navigated this. And he could have said, well, I'm not going to use Belteshazzar as my name. I'm going to ask permission not to. Some things he just said, I'm going to submit. That's fine. It's not who I am. You can't change whom I am just by changing my name. You can call me whatever you want. He always wrote Daniel when he was writing his own book. And that's what he did. Another great example is Paul and Silas in prison, right? They're in prison. They're in the deepest dungeon, and things flow downhill, but they're still singing, and it's midnight, and they're just pretty happy. And then there's this earthquake, the chains break. They're like, all right, God's come to rescue us. Let's skedaddle. But they said, no, this jailer's in charge of us, and he's going to be in bad shape if we just run out of here. Let's see if we can do it another way. They actually, I think, had to talk to the rest of the prison. They were all still there. I'm sure those guys weren't, what do you mean? I'm not a Christian. I'm out of here. I'm taking advantage of this. Somehow they convinced everybody, look, let's not do this. That's how they lived. So, for us today, there's some easy ones to point at. Abortion clinics protesting the murder of unborn babies. Yeah. Bombing an abortion clinic in the name of Christ, yeah, I think we'd all agree Jesus would not put his seal of approval there. Speaking out against, the war in Iraq, you don't think it's right? Okay. Protesting at soldiers' funerals in the name of Christ. Your son or daughter deserved to die because it was an unjust war. Yeah, not so much. So we live in this society where we can disagree, right? It's okay. It's not a totalitarian regime. We're encouraged to have a healthy debate. Our government debates within itself, within its branches, within parties. It's part of the process. Citizens can disagree. They're allowed to protest. It's all part of that. But Christians should always be respectful in these kinds of debates. Should always be honoring in these kind of discussions, right? Christians should be known for that. You disagree? Okay, fine. Say it nicely. I have to ask permission to protest? They want me to file a permit? Okay, fine. Don't just say, forget them. We should be known for that. We shouldn't be using these freedoms as an excuse to hide something. During the quarantine period, we found out at some point that we could have kept still meeting the whole time. There was actually a little bit of wiggle room in the rules that we could have said, we don't really have a way to do a remote service. We're small. We said, no, let's just figure something else out. Let's try to help our community. Our leaders are asking us to do this. Maybe they don't know what they're talking about because this is all still a new, maybe they overreacted. I don't know. I'm not going to use my excuse to disagree as to just do whatever I want. Let's just go ahead and abide by that. Even though it's inconvenient, let's go ahead and do it. The Christian left versus the Christian right. A lot of mudslinging in some people. I know it's probably the vocal minorities, that most Christians aren't like that. But again, in political life, what should it be like? What does submission to government authorities look like? What should Christians be known for? For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people, not inflame it by going, oh, look at those Christians, right? What about social media? Anonymity and physical distance make us feel like we can say whatever we want, however we want to say it. Hashtag not my president. I didn't vote for him. It doesn't matter. I don't think any Christian should get to say, well, I didn't vote for him, so I don't have to do what he says. No, you don't have to like his policies. And that's whether it's Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, whoever comes next. Anybody else, doesn't matter. Governors, mayors, okay, yeah, we can disagree. But they're our leaders. The order of the day is that they're the leader, and we need to submit. And not just obey, not just look for the loopholes. And it's, a lot of them aren't very easy to figure out. I mean, the war in Vietnam, there are a lot of people that in good conscience, they felt like, as a Christian, I cannot participate in this war. And there were just as many people that said, as a Christian, I must do my part. If I'm going to enlist, or if they draft me, I'm going to go willingly. Some of those are hard to figure out. You have to follow your conscience. But if your conscience is saying one thing, if God is saying one thing, don't use the excuse, right? Mike talked about speed limits. Now I'm down to smaller things. But smaller things that we kind of ignore because, so what if I didn't report all my tips on my taxes? Well, the law asks you to report it all. That's what. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And we can think of a lot of little things. But that's what I want to challenge you with, is that what Peter is saying, what Paul is saying in the other verse, what the Bible is telling us is to live such good lives that we silence the talk of ignorant people. That Christians should be known for this. That Christians are to be good citizens because they are obedient to the Lord, not good Christians because they're obedient to the state. See the difference there? Christians are to be good citizens because they're obedient to the Lord, not good Christians because you're obedient to the state. You got to get the horse before the cart. We should be known for this. And going back to what I opened with, this backdrop of the protests and all that, yep, that's happening. There is. I mean, it sickens me to see what happened to this poor man. And it is an inflammatory incident. But and sure, if you want to demonstrate against it, protest, whatever, sure. Things need to change. Yeah. But above all that, and above whatever the next issue of is in a year's time, in 5 years' time, what is our attitude? What are we seen as? What are we known for? And in the little things as much as in the big things. In the speed limits and the taxes that nobody will ever know. Whether you sped, whether you included your tips, I don't know, whatever else little things are out there. Okay, but for the sake of the Lord, for the Lord's sake, I'm going to do it anyway. Does that make sense? All right. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your word. And Lord, help us to, I know that, speaking for myself, there's some areas that this has challenged me. And Lord, help us to, from the heart, take thought and time in how we act and how we react in the public arena towards our government, towards our leaders. Lord, that we wouldn't just skip to what everyone else is doing without first considering whether it is what you would want us to do. And if yes, then yes, and if no, then no. And especially, Lord, that we would live lives where the exception is only the exception. It's not a life full of exceptions. That we are normally just people that are submitted to our government. Amen. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week. And we'll see you back here next, other than Zooming and stuff like that, back here next Sunday. So be blessed.